Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We are talking fantasy baseball. My name is Eric Henriksen alongside Josh Day, coming to you with our very first episode. Welcome to the pod.
Hey, welcome in everybody. Let's talk baseball.
So, who are we? Again, my name is Eric. That's Josh. We are fantasy baseball aficionados. We love fantasy baseball. It's our hobby. We are bringing our expertise of head to head categories with a focus of 10 to 12 team leagues to you, showing you what's worked for us, what hasn't worked for us, and hopefully bring you closer to a championship. So, welcome in. We're here to talk fantasy baseball. Let's get going. It is draft season. It's the beginning of the year. This is the
Oh yeah.
most wonderful time of the year, in my opinion. Drafting is one of my favorite things to do. So,
Yeah.
how do you set yourself up for success year in and year out? If you haven't played with Josh, you've probably had a better chance of winning your league. He's very, very good, and he makes it very, very difficult to be successful against him. So, I know it starts at the draft, your championship runs year after year. How do you set
I
your
don't know. I wish.
How do you set yourself up for success?
Yeah, well, I think the draft, that's the most important moment of your season because you're setting up your the pillars of your lineup. And in particular, it's your opportunity to grab the players that are going to deliver or most likely to deliver the best stats. And that's generally within, I think, rounds 1 through 6. So I think it's just very important to do lots of research, look at stats from last season and seasons prior, and just really kind of get a sense of who these players are, and also just obsessively follow spring training and just kind of see what are they doing right now, what skills are they, what are they showing us that they're going to do. Are they going to hit power? Are they going to get speed? Also looking at the reports, looking at the injury news, like which players are healthy. What's going on with Gunnar Henderson? I don't know, is he worth the first round pick? I think just now is the moment to really surround yourself with information, so that you can make the best choices when you're, in a live draft. What are some things that you look at?
I tend to, for older players, I tend to look to see how they did in the second half
Yep.
of the season, the previous year, to see if they started to fall off or if they maintained their pace. Really see how players' performance either improved or declined, if they've had stark differences in first half, second half. But then you've got a player like Paul Goldschmidt, who just got progressively worse last season. So it's something to look into whether or not a player's skills have changed. If you're looking at younger players, I would say, did they grow? Did they get better? But when it
Mhm.
comes to spring training, I know there's one specific stat that you really like to look into because, and it truly is indicative of how a player is doing in the spring. There's a lot of, spring training doesn't count. You shouldn't look into it too much. But this one stat that you really like is something that you think is very helpful, and I agree with you.
Yeah, it's on baseballreference.com. They have a really great spreadsheets of spring training stats, and one thing that they have is opposition quality, or opqual, as they refer to it. And that
I believe that's what
shows.
the kids say, opqual.
Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah, so opqual, I believe it's 1 through 10, 10 being the hardest. It really shows you, if we're talking batter or pitcher, we're seeing how tough the pitching is. And I think this is very important for especially younger players, or maybe you're looking at some rookies that are starting, and you're able to see, like, well, how are they doing? Are they finding success in spring training? Yes. What is the quality of pitching they're facing? Oh, it's not that hard. Maybe their success isn't as real as it might be in the majors. But then you see, like, oh, actually, their opposition quality is quite high. It's an 8. So, okay, these young hitters are able to roll with major league pitching. So yeah, I think opposition quality is a great thing to see. Like, oh, this is real. What is real in spring training? It's a great metric for determining that.
It's not necessarily indicative for an experienced player yet, like Yordan Alvarez, right? Like, we know who Yordan Alvarez is. He's got an opponent quality of 8.3, but he's hitting .083 this spring. not good. But a player like him might just be working on something. Like you said, it's very good to look at for younger players. When you're looking at somebody like Kyle Manzardo or Red Sox prospect Marcelo Meyer, Manzardo and Meyer both have an opponent quality of 8.2. So that likely means that they are not just facing minor camp invite, double A or triple A prospect pitchers. They are probably facing major league caliber arms. Now, they've played in 7 spring games each, have about 20 plate appearances apiece. Meyer's hitting 298 and Manzardo's hitting 375. So what you're looking at there are a decent sample size of good opponent pitching, and they're having success. That's indicative of them actually having a good spring. Perhaps there are some skill advancements that Manzardo's had because he didn't have much success at the major league level when he got called up last year, despite having a very good AAA season. Marcelo Meyer, a top prospect who hasn't gotten the call yet, perhaps he's ready. So you look at these numbers, opponent quality, and the results of that, and it can tell you whether or not a player is ready. A player might get off to a hot start, or they're not ready. Let's say that opponent quality number is high, they're a young player, and their numbers are terrible. Christian Campbell is a good example. Maybe he's not ready.
Doesn't look like it.
Maybe he just needs a couple of months in AAA, right? Opponent quality is a key indicator, a key stat that we like to look at. Again, that's on baseballreference.com. You can just Google spring training 2025 stats, and it should be one of the first links up there in your Google search, and you can sort by that number. But what else do you do to prepare that maybe would require you to change your approach year after year?
I tend to look at ADP is very important to me because that tells me where these players that are likely to hit, power and speed guys, power guys, stolen base specialists. Maybe that's a bad example because they're not as relevant anymore. But it tells me where these players are going in the draft, tells me where I start need to think about drafting these players. Not only that, but when you start breaking the players down into positions, you can really see where the scarcity is. So if, say, there's a ton of shortstop options, I might wait a bit longer to grab a shortstop rather than a first baseman, which I think is a pretty shallow position after the top 5 first basemen. So that kind of ADP really shows me where I should prioritize where to start grabbing these players and how I want to kind of build a loose roadmap of my drafts. And I think a really great exercise in kind of figuring out this roadmap is just by mock draft, doing a lot of those. Mock drafts are a really great tool for kind of, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think mock drafts are great. Doing all your mock drafts in a matter of a couple days, don't do that. Spread them out. Do some at the beginning of draft season, some in the middle, and some at the end, so you can see which players are moving up, which players are moving down. Because whereas that ADP number may not change significantly, how people are drafting that player is. So it's very important to spread out those mock drafts and do quite a few of them. So you want to set yourself up in your prep, in your research. Now, what do you actually take into the draft? What do you have with you that you might be looking on your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many computer screens you got? I hope you're not drafting on your phone. Please, nobody draft on your phone. You're not setting yourself up for success drafting on your phone. All that work that you've done in the spring.
I don't know. I think my first season I played fantasy, I did draft on my phone.
You had a smartphone back then?
I had the first one, prototype. Yeah, I think I drafted on a phone, and I had like my 2-year-old son. I was like doing dishes and drafting, and like I had my son in my other arm, and it was I don't know. I managed to win the league that year, so I don't know.
That's how good Josh is, ladies and gentlemen. He can win by multitasking and drafting. Now, me, I couldn't get away with that. There's no chance. I have to sit with my monitors. I've got the draft window open. I've got my spreadsheet open. I've got ADP open. I've got the websites that I use as roster resources and articles and rankings and all that stuff. I've got as many windows as I possibly can open. It's a miracle I find the actual draft window.
I have tried a couple of tools that promise like, oh, we can integrate your sleeper list into your draft. And like it comes to like draft day and I do that and it just like completely messes up the draft room and like I can't see what other people are seeing in terms of ADP. And I just like end up freaking out at the last minute and just have it on default.
Yeah, yeah.
So I kind of don't recommend any site that, you spending monetary investments on some of these tools. I think it's for me, I like to do like just obsessive studying kind of before draft day. I guess it's like doing, like a school test or something. And then I kind of just come in maybe with like a one sheet just because I find I just want to really be focused on what's happening live and not be too in my head. But that's just me. Some people like to have many windows and pages open and
To be clear, I have all of them open and I probably use maybe three, right? Like
okay.
basically 90% of any materials that you might put together, anything that you might open just goes out the window because you're so concentrated on what's happening in front of you in the draft. You've got to
Right.
keep up with who people are drafting. Do you miss the reliever run? Do you miss the shortstop that you're targeting later in drafts?
Right.
You have to pay attention. So there's only so many things. Now, like I said, I open them all up, but whether I use them or not. I just feel comfortable that way. It's like getting in the zone.
Lately, I've found having like my short list of like sleeper pitchers tend to be most helpful for me because they tend to be scattered through, like the later draft rounds. These sleeper pitchers tend to go anywhere from, ADP of like 120 all the way up to 500. So all over the place in the draft, ADP wise. So I think having like a little short list helps kind of keep accountability of that in my mind. So I'm not scrolling through the draft ADP.
Roster construction, I think, in a head-to-head league is extremely important. We have our own personal strategy of what works. On the pitching side, it's basically 7 starters and 4 relievers is like the magic number that somehow seems to work for us in our leagues with one bench hitter. So basically, you're taking up the rest of your bench with starting pitchers. You're getting as many starts as you can. You can get away with 8 starters and 3 relievers these days because there aren't as many closers. So you don't need as many to be competitive. But roster construction, I think, is something very important to your success in a head to head categories league. And that starts in the first 5, 6 rounds of the draft, which you alluded to earlier.
Mhm.
In the beginning of the draft, what are you looking for? Not necessarily this year. It's
Yeah.
a year after year thing. When you're building out your roster, what are you looking to do in the early rounds?
You want stability. You want who is most likely to give their return on investment, if not more. A great example of a comparison would be, Juan Soto, super stable, really know what you're going to get year in, year out, versus like Ellie De La Cruz, who has big, flashy upside, but he can also, he's a pretty high variance where he has a lower floor. So I think you're going to want to mitigate your risk by looking at players that have more stable floors, such as Juan Soto. I also think that drafting bats in the first maybe 1 or 2 rounds is a much better choice than, say, pitching, which is, I think, very high variance just in nature based on more likely to get injured, mechanics getting thrown out of whack. That's what I typically look for when building out my pillars of my roster.
High floor players, predictable floor players, mitigating the risk early. Like you said, at the beginning, you want to set your roster up for predictable outcomes. You don't want to invest in guys who are hurt early. Leave that for the end of the draft. And that brings us to a strategy we like to employ towards the end and immediately post draft when it comes to injured players and actually filling out those hidden IL roster spots.
I think when I was starting out, playing fantasy baseball, I wouldn't really think of the aisle spots during draft day. That was just kind of like, oh, well, they're just there in case the players that I did draft need, and if they get injured, I'll just throw them there. Where in reality is you can view them as 3 to 4 extra bench spots. for players that you can invest in the future, going into the season whenever they might become healthy. Because a lot of the guys that are injured that don't get drafted are probably of a higher talent than the waiver options that are out there. So yeah, I think post draft, have a list, have another list, another short list of injured players, check and see if they're still available. If they are, grab them, throw them on your IL.
It helps set yourself up for a deeper roster, and I should say predictable depth, because you can always pick up a hot bat. You can always pick up a hot pitcher. But then we start getting into, is it real or not real? Segment coming up in future episodes. So early on, set yourself up for success with predictable floors. Later on, you can take those risks, draft those injured players. It really gives you the depth later on in the draft and sets yourself up for the rest of the season to be
Yeah.
successful, and gives you more flexibility. It's as simple as that. All right, so we talked about opponent quality when it comes to evaluating spring performance and whether or not we should take it at face value or not. What are some other advanced stats that you look at that helps you in your draft prep process? I'm not talking about home runs, RBIs, batting average. Those are surface level. We're talking advanced. We're going next level here. We're talking fantasy baseball. So what are some of those advanced stats that you look at to give you the edge?
Oh boy, there's so many to choose from. I don't know where to start. I guess with hitting, I like to look at how hard they're hitting the ball, like soft, medium, hard contact. Because if a power hitter is not hitting for power, I'll look at those three stats, and if it's leaning more into the medium soft, something tells me maybe there's a mechanical issue going on. Maybe there's a hidden injury. That's where I kind of go to look for that kind of stuff. I also like to look at ground ball rate. If it's north of 50, I think that's problematic because you're not going to get they're not lifting the ball. That's definitely some of my go-tos for hitting. What about you?
Ah, man. I like to look at plate discipline.
Yeah.
So we're talking about your O swing percent, your Z swing percent, your contact percentage, your swinging strike rate. So I like to look at those specific things, and you can find those on Fangraphs under the plate discipline category. That tells you the amount of contact a player is making. And if it's any good, you'll see that reflected in the kind of contact that you were talking about: ground ball rate, launch angle.
Yep. Launch angle.
If they're swinging too much out of the zone, that's their O swing percentage. Z swing percentage is if they're swinging at pitches in the zone. Are they swinging too much in general? That's just their swing percentage.
Yeah.
And then their swinging strike rate is how often they swing and miss, right? So I think those stats are very indicative of if a player is sort of on the cusp or if they're really struggling. Because you can really struggle and still hit the ball really hard. You can hit the ball in the air really hard. You can hit the ball on the ground really hard. But if if you're swinging at the wrong pitches, you're not going to have good results. So
Right.
you can see that in swinging strike rate, zone swing, contact percentage, all of that. I think those statistics are really indicative. Like Wyatt Langford last year is a great example. Surface level stats were not great. His StatCast was just okay. But if you looked at his contact metrics, he was hitting the ball, he wasn't swinging too much, and he wasn't swinging and missing too much. Everything was there that you want to see from a player who is going to break out. And I think Wyatt Langford this year, you're going to see what everyone thought he would be last year. It's there. The talent level is there, and the swinging percentage numbers that we just talked about were indicative of that. So how do you, going through the season, use these advanced stats to your advantage?
Well, I think as you're saying, it's the key into understanding what a player is doing. Is their success sustainable, or is it, what is the floor? And I think a really great metric that works for both hitting and pitching is BABIP. If their BABIP typically is 300 is basically the average. So anything, if a player is hitting like 500 BABIP, for sure it's going to come down because that's just not sustainable. But So yeah, I think looking at things like BABIP is really key to kind of seeing what's real and what's not, what's sustainable, what's not. I think also understanding BABIP can help you with things like trades, like when to, if you're seeing like a player that has a really high BABIP and it's getting a lot of buzz for maybe a sustained couple of weeks, like that might be a good opportunity for you to try and move that player.
Yeah, I do think there is an asterisk that you need to put next to BABIP though, and that is some players have a tendency to have a higher BABIP based on their type of contact that they usually make, and some have a lower BABIP. A great example is Aaron Judge. That man hits the ball as hard as he possibly can every time he makes contact. And you can see it in his StatCast page. It's lit up as like red as a ripe tomato, right? So Aaron Judge hits the ball super hard. When you hit the ball super hard, your BABIP tends to be higher. So you can look at Aaron Judge's career BABIP and it tends to be higher than 300. So if you have a guy who has a lower BABIP, that typically means that their quality of contact not necessarily is bad, but perhaps they're putting the ball in the air too much, right? Like Kyle Schwarber is a great example. He elevates the ball a lot. His fly ball percentage is typically in the high 40s, even the low 50s. And when you elevate the ball that much, your batting average on balls in play, your BABIP, is typically lower. So he tends to have a lower BABIP. So I think you need to take BABIP with a bit of an asterisk and understand how certain players can be evaluated on that. Should their BABIP be higher based on their type of quality, or should it be lower based on their type of quality? I think understanding how all of these stats, when you look at them as a whole, all together, it really paints that complete picture.
For sure.
Oh, yeah. And I think a couple players that it's important to take that complete picture into account are some high-end hitters that maybe rode the struggle bus for a good portion of last year.
Mm-hmm.
Or did they? We're alluding to Julio Rodriguez and Corbin Carroll. Both of them struggled for a majority of the first half last year. Julio struggled for the majority of the season and then was derailed with an ankle injury as he was seemingly turning it around. As a guy drafted in the top 5 last season, he was very disappointing, and I think the same could be said for Corbin Carroll. However, Carroll seemed to turn it around halfway through last season.
Carroll came pretty close to matching his 2023. 2023, he hit 25 home runs, 24, 22. 2023 RBI, 76, 24, 74 stolen bases, 54, 35. So, I mean, pretty close.
Yeah. His overall production was very, very close. He played 3 more games last year, in fact, and everyone was questioning whether or not he was hurt. I will say this. Look at his BABIP. Last year, his BABIP was 256. In 2023, his BABIP was 325. That is a 70-point difference, which led to a 50-point drop in batting average. So was he unlucky?
I'm not sure. To me, as a Corbin Carroll owner, I went with the narrative that he was injured. That was the story for the first half of the season. But yeah, I mean, I guess some of it could have been luck. I also read stories that he like thought it would be a good idea to like change his swing last off season, and that threw him off somehow. His first half, the first half of the season was a bit of a head scratcher for me. The fact that he bounced back to the tune of what he had been doing the year before at least allayed some of my fears of who Corbin Carroll was, and the fact that he's red hot in spring training right now also is allaying some of those fears. Although
Flaming hot.
Although he's been out early this week with lower back tightness, so we'll see. But yeah, I think some of the numbers that you're bringing up are pretty interesting to take an account of the full picture of last year.
If you look at his batted ball profile, he hit fewer line drives, he hit more fly balls, and he hit more ground balls. So that recipe right there would lead you to believe, okay, his BABIP should go down. Now, if we look at his plate discipline, and this is what you want to see out of a younger hitter, he swung at fewer pitches out of the zone. He swung at fewer pitches in general That's why his walk rate went up. So he had a better eye at the plate. His swinging strike rate went down 1.5 points. So to me, when you take that into consideration, all the numbers, his quality of contact, the type of contact, the amount of contact, all speaks to exactly what you want to see from a young player. So there may have been a bit of bad luck.
I would guess he's going to hit mid-20s homers, maybe 40 stolen bases and 260 average this season.
Like you said, mid-20s homers. He's going to score well over 100 runs and,
Yep.
knock in probably between 70 and 80 runs.
Yeah, it's a good lineup too. So
very good lineup improved with Josh Naylor coming over. Just not necessarily the best place for a lefty to hit, but some guys can just sort of ignore that because they're really good.
Yeah.
To be clear, Corbin Carroll is very good. But if we want to go back to the mitigating risk conversation that we had, do you want to invest your first round pick in Corbin Carroll? Or do you want to invest someone who might be a little bit more predictable? And I always go back to Jose Ramirez because he's one of my favorite fantasy players of all time. I've named my teams after him. And I just think his floor is very, very predictable. So moving on to Julio Rodriguez, I think we have a decent track record now. We have 3 years in a row where we know he's going to stink in April. Like, just be prepared that he's not going to be very good for about the first 4 to 6 weeks of the year. And then he should turn it around. However, that never quite materialized last season. He struggled a lot. And as a Julio Rodriguez owner, that was rough. What do you think is the real Julio Rodriguez? Is he 2023? Is he 2022?
I mean, I think looking at an average, it just seems like he's going to be upper 20s homer, basically going to be like a 30-30 threat probably for the next several years. I mean, how old is he? 20.
He's 24.
Yeah, so I'd probably say he's probably going to be a 30-30 threat probably through the prime of his career. And I think probably 270s average. And one of the biggest problems I see for him right now, not looking at stats for a second, is I just think that team is really poor around him. Like the surrounding cast of the Mariners is pretty ugly.
I believe the kids say mid.
Well, I'm not even sure if it's mid. I think it might be below that.
Yeah, not great.
Pitching's great, but I don't know what their plan is for that.
They should
hitting,
trade some of that pitching.
Yeah. So I just think his counting stats, like right now, his RBI numbers are like lucky to get mid 80s, which isn't great for like a first rounder. I mean, short term, I think that would be my biggest concern for a player like this. I think since he's shown us that he's off to slow starts, then I guess that's what you just have to expect and act accordingly. The fact that he dealt with an injury last year, that can happen to any player. So that's just the luck of the draw, as they say.
There is luck to this game. It's head-to-head categories. Your team has a cold week. Your opponent, who might be at the bottom of the standings, you're at the top, has a hot week. You lose. It happens. Yep. It happens. There's some luck to this, but we're here to help you mitigate that luck factor.
I mean, speaking of spring and luck, it looks like his ISO is up and his K rate's 22%, so that's not bad. He's walking. Looks like his BABIP is down. It's at 154 right now, so maybe he's just having some bad luck. I don't know.
I would tend to agree with you. It's unlucky low. When your ISO is at 421, your batting average should not be 211. It should be way higher. That means you're hitting doubles, you're hitting home runs, you're hitting triples. You are cranking the ball. And he's had a bit of an unlucky spring. But will he rebound going into next season? Going into this season, I should say. He's a bit of a free swinger. He makes really good contact when he makes contact, and he makes enough contact. You want to see a contact percentage. Usually, I should say your zone contact percentage. You want to see it above 80%. Elite hitters are going to be 84, 85. and Julio's just around 81. And then his actual contact percentage is in the low 70s. You would ideally like that number to be in the 80s, but that's because he swings at too many pitches out of the zone, right?
Yep.
So if he can cut down on his K rate, if he can lower the amount he swings, will he rebound? Is a good bet. I think you're right. I think he's like a 30-30 threat. But really, that's the ceiling, probably. It's not Ronald Acuna high, which is who everyone was comparing him to when he was coming up, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that just about does it for our first episode of Talkin' Fantasy Baseball. We hope you listen in and grow with us week after week. We hope to be live at some point on YouTube as well. For the next episode, we'll highlight some key players we're looking at for the season. We'll judge some prospects and rookies, and we'll play a round of Real or Not Real, one of our fun segments that we have planned as we move into the season. So please subscribe, give us a like, a 5-star rating, a kind review. We will read all of them. And we hope you follow us on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. And if there's anything you want to talk about, drop us a message. We're going to really try and make this podcast interactive with you, especially once we go live. For Josh, on the other side there, my name is Eric. Thanks so much for listening in to our first episode, and we can't wait to bring you more. Have a good one.
Hi, everybody.